The kid behind the counter picked the tobacco tin off the glass with 2 fingers, turned it over once like he was looking for an expiration date, and set it back down. "Yeah. Old tin. We get these. I can do $12. Walter Henson stood on the other side of the counter. 80 years old, the Navy 1st Infantry Division ball cap his father had worn for 40 years pulled low over his eyes, the small, flat tobacco tin sitting on the glass between them, and watched a 23-year-old in a Sunbelt pawn polo look at the only physical thing he had left of a father he had barely known and see $12 worth of rusted metal. "That was my dad's," Walter said, quiet. The kid, Tristan by the crooked name tag, shrugged and slid the tin an inch across the glass with his thumbnail. "Sure, 12, final." Here's what that kid in the pawn shop didn't know. Here's what nobody in that shop knew. The 1917 Lucky Strike Flat 50 tobacco tin. Walter Henson had just set down on that counter was worth by itself about $40 on a good day to the right collector. But folded inside the tin, under the original tax stamp, sealed for 106 years, was a 4-page letter written in pencil on YMCA stationery, dated May 22, 1918, from a place called Cantigny, France. The letter was signed Private Earl Henson, Company K, 28th Infantry, 1st Division. 6 days after Earl Henson sealed that tin, his regiment captured the village of Cantigny in the first major American offensive of the First World War. 8 days after he sealed it, Earl took shrapnel in his left lung and right shoulder. 2 months after that, Earl was sent home on a hospital ship from Brest with a Distinguished Service Cross and a permanent limp and orders never to do heavy work again. He never opened the tin. He carried it in his pocket for the next 58 years and gave it to his son on his 83rd birthday in 1976 with the words, "Don't open this, son. Some things stay sealed." The letter inside was, in its own hand, the closest thing that exists in any private American collection to a real-time first-person account of the Battle of Cantigny written by a soldier who fought it. The Smithsonian had been searching for letters of that battle for 40 years. The whole package, tin, sealed tax stamp, letter, was about to be appraised at $118,000. This is the story of how Walter Henson walked into Sunbelt Pawn on a Wednesday morning in July with $760 of trouble in his head and walked out with the father he had never gotten to know, finally speaking to him in his own handwriting. Before I tell you what happened when the expert walked through that door, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let me tell you about Walter. Walter Earl Henson was born in 1944 in Bowling Green, Kentucky. His father, Earl Henson, was 48 years old when Walter was born and 62 when Walter graduated high school. Earl had come home from France in 1918, a broken-lunged man who could not lift more than 30 pounds and who could not climb stairs without resting halfway up. He had worked the cash register at a feed store on State Street in Bowling Green for 39 years because it was the only job he could hold. He had married Walter's mother, Florence, in 1942 when both of them were in their 40s and had given up on the idea of children. Walter had been a surprise. Earl had died of a heart attack in 1979 at age 85 in his sleep, in his recliner, with the television showing the late news. Florence had died in 1991. Earl had never talked to Walter about France. Not once. The closest he had ever come was the morning of Walter's 8th birthday in 1952, when Earl had pinned a small French enamel pin to Walter's shirt, a pin Walter still kept in a small box on his dresser, and said, "I got that in a town called Cantigny, son. Don't lose it." Walter had not known until he was 35 years old, going through Earl's papers after the funeral, that the small pin was a fragment from the regimental crest of the 28th Infantry, broken off a French farm wall by a sergeant during the battle and given to his father in a field hospital, Walter had served 3 years in the Army himself in the 1960s, stateside, and had spent 34 years as a pipefitter at the General Motors plant in Bowling Green. Married Hazel in 1969, lost Hazel to ovarian cancer in 2018. Raised one son, Earl, named for Walter's father, who lived in Lexington and worked for the state and called every Sunday at 6 p.m. The eye surgery was the problem. Walter's left eye had developed a cataract last winter that the ophthalmologist in Bowling Green said needed to come out before it dropped his vision below the legal driving threshold. The surgery was covered. The pre-op tests, the anti-rejection drops, the 2 follow-up appointments at the regional hospital, and the special distance glasses he'd need afterward came to $760 out of pocket. Without the surgery, he'd lose his license. Without the license, he could not get to his cardiologist in Nashville. Without his cardiologist, he'd be dead inside 2 years. The math on it was that simple. His pension from GM was $1,920 a month. Social Security added $2,156. After property taxes on the small house on Magnolia Avenue, the gas, the electric, the supplemental insurance, the cardiology medications that ran him $310 a month even with Medicare Part D, and the groceries, he had about $100 of slack in a good month. He did not have $760. He could have called Earl Jr. Earl Jr. made a respectable salary working for the state of Kentucky, but Earl Jr.'s wife had MS, and the medical bills in Lexington had been crushing them for 3 years. Walter had not asked his son for $1 in 25 years, and he was not going to start over a cataract. For 5 days, he stretched his groceries and looked at the tobacco tin sitting on the dresser beside his father's French enamel pin. On the 6th morning, Wednesday, he picked the tin up, put it in the pocket of his Carhartt vest, and drove the Buick to town. The Buick had a slow oil leak that Walter had been topping off for 2 years. He sat in the parking lot of Sunbelt Pawn on Scottsville Road for a long minute before he turned the engine off. He put his hand in his vest pocket and felt the small, flat shape of the tin against his fingers. He thought about Earl in the recliner in 1979, and Earl in 1952 with the small French pin, and Earl, who had never once in 85 years opened his own tobacco tin to take the letter out and read it. Some things stay sealed. Walter had honored his father's instruction for 48 years. He took the tin in his hand and went inside. The bell over the door jangled. Tristan was on his phone behind the counter, and he did not look up for 9 seconds. "Help you?" "I've got a tobacco tin." "From the First World War. My dad's." "Let's see it." Tristan set the phone down face up on the glass. Walter took the tin out of his vest pocket and set it on the counter. The tin was small, flat, about the size of a deck of cards, but a little wider. The classic flat 50 Lucky Strike rectangular shape. The lid was a faded forest green with the red Lucky Strike target and white lettering, the corners rusted, the edges worn smooth by 58 years in his father's pocket. A small federal tax stamp ran across the seam where the lid met the body of the tin, the seal still intact, the printed date barely visible in the gummed paper, 1917. Tristan picked the tin up by the lid, turned it over, squinted at the bottom. "Yeah, Lucky Strike. We get these. People bring them in with old coins inside, old buttons, costume jewelry, whatever. $12 for the tin. If there's anything inside it, I'll look, but I gotta open it." It's sealed, son. Hasn't been opened in over 100 years. My dad sealed it during the First World War." "Sure, Pops." Tristan pried at the tax stamp with his thumbnail. The 106-year-old gum cracked. The seal began to lift. "Son, please don't." "It's fine, man. We have to know what's inside or it's just a tin." Tristan worked his thumbnail under the lid and tried to pop the tin open. The lid had been pressed down 106 years ago, and the rim had oxidized. It did not pop. He gave up. Set the tin back down on the glass with a soft clatter. The tax stamp now hung half detached from the seam, a brown flap of brittle paper. "Yeah, $12. Final. I can't even tell what's inside of it. Could be empty for all I know. Probably is." Walter's left hand, the one resting on the glass, had begun to tremble in a way it did when he was either very tired or very angry. He pressed it flat against the cold glass. He looked at the tax stamp hanging by a thread of brittle gum. He thought about Earl in the field hospital at Cantigny. He thought about a sergeant breaking a piece of enamel off a French farm wall and putting it in a wounded private's hand. He thought about his father at the kitchen table on the morning of his own 8th birthday in 1952, pinning that piece of enamel onto a small boy's shirt with hands that had not been able to lift more than 30 pounds in 34 years. He did not pick up the tin. He did not say yes. He did not say no. He stood there with both hands flat on the glass and his mouth closed tight because the only other thing he could do was cry in front of a 23-year-old, and Walter Henson had not cried in front of another human being since the morning he buried Hazel in 2018. The bell over the door jangled again. A man came in, mid-50s, slim, salt and pepper hair cut short, a neatly trimmed gray mustache, round tortoise-shell glasses. He wore a brown tweed jacket with leather elbow patches over a cream button-down shirt, brown corduroy trousers, and brown brogue shoes that had been polished that morning. He carried a flat brown leather portfolio under his arm and a small canvas tool roll in his right hand. He stopped just inside the door and looked around the way a man looks around when he's about to ask directions. And then he saw the tin on the counter. His eyes went to the half-detached tax stamp. He went still. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was soft, with the trace of a Boston accent that 53 years of living in Tennessee had not erased. "I don't mean to intrude, but, sir, that tin on your counter. May I ask whose it is?" Tristan looked up. "Old guy's selling. $12. The man did not look at Tristan. He looked at Walter. "Sir, my name is Dr. Henry Calloway. I am the senior curator of military and political history at the Frist Center in Nashville, and I serve on the advisory board of the National World War I Museum in Kansas City. I drove up to Bowling Green this morning to look at a Civil War saber a man called me about. I stopped here for a cup of coffee at the Wendy's next door, and I saw the pawn sign. Would you permit me, please, to examine that tin without opening it any further than it has already been opened?" Walter found his voice. "You're asking me? It's yours, isn't it?" "Yes, sir." "Then yes, sir, I am asking you. And I am asking you to please not let anyone open that tin until I have had a chance to look at it. The tax stamp on the seam is a 1917 federal tobacco tax revenue stamp. If that stamp is original to the tin and the tin has not been opened since the stamp was applied, the contents inside that tin have not been disturbed since the First World War. That is, sir, that is the rarest condition any tobacco tin from this period can be in. Do you understand?" Walter nodded slowly. Tristan was looking at Dr. Calloway with the expression of a young man who has just realized he is no longer the most important person in the room. Dr. Calloway set his leather portfolio on the counter. He set the canvas tool roll beside it and unrolled it slowly. Inside were a pair of folded white cotton archival gloves, a small LED maglite, a brass 10x jeweler's loop in a velvet pouch, a soft sable brush, a small pair of stainless steel archival tweezers, and a leather-bound notebook. He pulled the gloves on finger by finger. "May I lift it, sir?" Walter nodded. Dr. Calloway picked the tin up the way a man picks up a soap bubble, both hands beneath. He turned it slowly under the fluorescent lights. He examined the lid. He examined the bottom. He brought the loop to his eye and held it over the tax stamp at the seam. He clicked on the LED flashlight and shone it across the gummed paper at a grazing angle. He went still. "Oh, sir," he said, very quietly. "Oh." He turned the tin again. He examined the rust patterns on the corners. He examined the wear pattern across the front face, the faint, smooth oval where Earl's thumb had rested in his pocket for 58 years. He set the tin gently on a soft black cloth he produced from his portfolio. He took off his gloves. He looked at Walter. "Sir, what is your name?" "Walter Henson, sir." "Mr. Henson, whose tin is this?" My father's, Earl Henson. He served in the First World War. Dr. Calloway closed his eyes for a moment. Mr. Henson, I want to be very careful with what I say next. I do not want to overstate what I am looking at. But the tax stamp on the seam of this tin is a 1917 Federal Series of 1917 tobacco revenue stamp, intact and unbroken across the lid seam until very recently. The stamp has been disturbed in the last few minutes. He glanced at Tristan without expression. But it has not been broken through to the contents. If you permit, I would like to ask my colleagues at the National World War I Museum to bring the tin to their conservation lab in Kansas City. There, in a controlled environment, we can carefully open it. If what is inside that tin has been sealed since 1917 or 1918, and if there is anything written or anything personal inside, we are looking at one of the rarest categories of First World War American soldier ephemera that exists. I am quite serious about this. Walter's mouth was dry. There's a letter inside, sir. At least, my father said there was. He never opened it. He said some things stay sealed. Dr. Calloway looked at him for a long moment. Mr. Henson, may I ask what unit your father served with? 28th Infantry Regiment, Company K, 1st Division. The fluorescent tube over the door flickered. Dr. Calloway took off his round tortoise-shell glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers, put the glasses back on. Mr. Henson, the 28th Infantry of the 1st Division was one of the 4 American regiments that captured the village of Cantigny on May 28, 1918, the first major American offensive of the First World War. The regiment took 240 casualties in 3 days. The National World War I Museum has been searching for first-person letters written by 28th Infantry soldiers in the days immediately before the Cantigny attack for more than 40 years. There are 6 known letters from the regiment dated between May 20th and May 27th, 1918. 6, Mr. Henson, in the entire documented record. If your father wrote and sealed a letter inside that tin during the lead-up to that battle, it would be the 7th, and the only one that has been continuously sealed since the day it was written. Nobody in the shop spoke. A car horn sounded twice on Scottsville Road and stopped. At professional appraisal, and we would not know the precise figure until conservation has assessed the contents, a sealed, dated, unit-attributable Cantigny letter, together with its original tin and intact tax stamp, would, in my professional opinion, be valued for institutional acquisition or insurance purposes between $90,000 and $140,000. Conservative estimate, $118,000. Tristan made a small sound. He cleared his throat. I was going to say 25. Walter didn't look at him. Dr. Calloway picked the tin back up, very carefully, and set it inside a small archival-grade, clear plastic clamshell case he had also produced from his portfolio. He closed the case with 2 soft snaps. Mr. Henson, I'm not going to ask you to give me this tin today. I am going to give you my card, and I am going to ask you to call me when you have had time to think, and to call your son, and to talk this over with people you trust. But I will tell you, sir, I have been doing this work for 31 years, and I have never asked a stranger this with more care than I am asking you now. Please, do not let anyone else touch this tin. Please. Walter took the card. He took the clamshell case from Dr. Calloway's gloved hands with both of his own. He nodded once. He turned and walked out past Tristan without a word. In the parking lot, sitting in the Buick with the oil leak smell coming up through the floorboards, Walter Henson held the clamshell case against his chest and cried for the first time since 2018. He called Earl Jr. that night. He told him the whole story. Earl Jr. drove down from Lexington at 5 the next morning. The 2 of them sat at the Formica table with the tin on the glass between them, still inside Dr. Calloway's archival case, and Earl Jr., who had been named for a grandfather he had never met, cried for 15 minutes while Walter made him coffee. They called Dr. Calloway at 9. Dr. Calloway drove down with 2 conservators from the Friss Center the following Monday. The tin traveled to Kansas City in a custom-padded transport case in the back of a National World War I museum vehicle, escorted by Dr. Calloway personally. The opening was performed in the museum's conservation lab on the second Friday of August, with Walter and Earl Jr. present, with 2 conservators and a paper specialist working in cotton gloves under archival lighting with a video record running. The tax stamp was lifted with a heated palette knife. The lid was opened with a thin bone tool. Inside the tin, folded into a tight rectangle, was a 4-page letter written in pencil on YMCA stationery. The paper still the color of old cream, the pencil still legible, the folds still sharp. The conservator opened the letter with the slowness of a man defusing a bomb. The letter was dated May 22, 1918, Cantigny sector, France. It was addressed to my brother Joseph in Bowling Green. Walter's uncle Joseph Henson had died in 1934 in a railroad accident before Walter was born. Nobody in the family had known the letter existed, including Joseph himself, because Earl had never sent it. The first line of the letter read, "Joe. By the time you read this, the show will be over, and you'll know if I'm coming home or not." Walter sat in a folding chair against the wall of the conservation lab with both hands over his mouth and read his father's handwriting for the first time in his life. The letter described the men of Company K. It named 17 of them by name. It described the weight of the pack, the smell of the trench, the cold tinned beef, the French farm boy who brought eggs to sell each morning until a German shell killed him on May 21st. It described Earl's hopes, that he would come home, that he would marry, that he would have children, that he would teach his children to fish in the barren river the way his father had taught him. The last paragraph was a prayer. The last sentence read, "Joe, if I do not come home, tell our father I tried to be the man he raised." Earl. He had carried that letter sealed in his pocket for 58 years and had never shown it to a living soul. Earl had not been a complainer. He had not been a drinker. He had not been the kind of veteran who marched in parades or wore his medals to church. He had kept the Distinguished Service Cross in a velvet-lined box in the bottom of the bedroom closet and had taken it out exactly twice in Walter's memory, once on Memorial Day in 1955 to show Walter, and once in 1968 when Walter shipped to Fort Bragg for basic training and Earl had pressed the box into his son's hands at the Greyhound station and said, "Bring this back to me, son, and bring yourself back too." Walter had brought both back. Earl had received the box with a nod and put it back in the closet. They had never spoken of it again. What Walter understood, sitting in the conservation lab in Kansas City, reading the words, "Tell our father I tried to be the man he raised," was that his father had spent 61 years after the war waiting to find out whether he had become that man, and had never quite been sure of the answer, and had carried the question, sealed inside a tobacco tin in his pocket, every day of his working life. Walter Henson read the last sentence of the letter at a folding table in a museum conservation lab in Kansas City in August of 2024, 106 years after his father had written it, and for a long time after he was finished reading, he could not speak. The National World War I Museum acquired the letter, the tin, and the original 1917 tax stamp for institutional display through a permanent 99-year family loan. The museum paid the Henson family $108,000. The display in the Cantigny Gallery, dedicated in October, included a digital scan of every page of the letter, a small interactive transcript, the tin in a climate-controlled case, the broken French enamel pin from Walter's dresser, and a placard that read, "Lucky Strike Tobacco Tin and Sealed Letter, 1917 to 1918. Carried and sealed by Private Earl Henson, Company K, 28th Infantry Regiment, 1st Division, in the Cantigny sector, France, May 22, 1918. Letter discovered unopened in 2024. On loan from the family of Walter E. Henson, Bowling Green, Kentucky. Walter paid for the eye surgery. The cataract was removed in September and his vision returned. He paid the property taxes 3 years forward. He paid down what was left of Hazel's medical debt that had been hanging over him since 2018. He sent Earl Jr. $20,000 and told him to use it for his wife's MS treatment in Lexington and not to argue. He set up a small trust for his 3 grandchildren. He bought himself a new pair of distance glasses, and he bought Hazel a new headstone. The old one had weathered, with her full name and a line beneath that read, "Wife, Mother, loved completely." The Bowling Green Daily News ran the story on a Sunday. The Lexington Herald leader picked it up. The Tennessean ran it the following week because the Frist Center was involved. A producer from a documentary company in Washington called Earl Jr. about a film on private World War I letters in American collections. Earl Jr. said the family would think about it. A letter came to Walter's post office box in November. It was from a man in Bowling Green named James Wickert, 86 years old, whose grandfather had served in Company K of the 28th Infantry alongside Earl Henson. James Wickert had read the letter's transcript on the museum's website. His grandfather, a man named Albert Wickert, was named in Earl's letter, paragraph 2, line 6. James had not known his grandfather had ever been at Cantigny. His grandfather had never spoken of the war. James asked if Walter would be willing to meet for coffee. Walter wrote him back that afternoon. They met at a Cracker Barrel on US 31 the following Tuesday and sat in a booth by the window for 3.5 hours. 2 old men in their 80s, the grandsons of 2 privates from Company K, talking about the fathers and grandfathers they had only ever half known. And the next Sunday morning, back home in Bowling Green, Walter sat down for coffee at his usual corner table at Spencer's Coffee on State Street with his 2 oldest friends, Hollis Pruitt and Bill Maupin, the way he had every Sunday for 26 years. Hollis looked at him over the rim of his mug. "Heard you made the Daily News, Walt." "Heard that. Cantigny, huh?" "Cantigny." Bill shook his head. $12. $12, Walter agreed. The 3 of them laughed, the quiet, chest-deep laugh of old men who have lived long enough to know that the world rarely sees what matters, and that sometimes, if you wait long enough, it finally does. A kid in a pawn shop looked at that tin and said $12. He didn't know. They never do. If stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel, because some things have hidden worth.